Hello and welcome back. In this lecture I want to go through the environment of CodeBlocks, just kind of show you the graphical user interface, how you can actually do some different things. We're going to be doing many demonstrations, so a lot of the detail will come along with those demonstrations. But I did want to show you some of the basics. After you've successfully installed CodeBlocks, you should see an icon on the desktop, but if not, you should see it in your program view on Windows. To execute the IDE, you just double click on the icon, which I'm going to go ahead and do. Once you do that, CodeBlocks will start up. You may see a different version number here depending on what version you have. The first screen you'll see here is you'll see this CodeBlocks home screen. You may have seen a tip screen as well. You can just disable those tips. But this is CodeBlocks. This is the basic graphical user interface. What you should notice first is there's a menu bar at the top, and also above that you'll see the version number. But it has some of the basic menu options that come along with writing and executing code, and specifically for C. So you'll see a menu bar at the top with menu options, and then you'll see some toolbars below that. You'll see the management bar on the left-hand side and also the home screen on the right-hand side, and then at the bottom, again, another screen. So it's kind of divided between 3 or 4 screens here, at least divided by a menu bar, 2 toolbars, and then a screen on the left, middle, and bottom. And this is the typical environment you'll see when you write code. The top part here where my mouse is, you'll be your editor, and you'll start writing source code in here. On the left-hand side will be kind of a list of files in the project, how you manage your project. A project is a program, and it can have many different files. And then at the bottom, you'll typically have your output windows, and when you compile and stuff, you'll see output. That's at a high level. But let's go through some of the options first. Let's start right at the top with the menu bar. You'll see the file menu bar. What's important here is you can say new, and you can create some different source code templates, using templates. You can create an empty file, you can create a new class, a new project. I'm going to go through the process of creating a new project specifically in another lecture, which you'll need to do once you start writing code. But there is some other nice things in here where you can set build targets up. For the sakes of our class, you're not going to need to do a lot of this, but you should be aware that there are options here. There's also the open, where you can open up different source code files if you don't have a project, but we're going to be using projects. There's an import project that is useful if you want to convert a Microsoft Visual Studio project to a CodeBlocks project. And then there's an export as well if you want to export your project to a different kind of format. And then you have your properties tab. Properties is important because it can set a lot of the different preferences. If you select properties, what you should see is the properties for your project come up. So from the next menu option would be edit. You'll see a lot of things in here. Basic, your editor, once you select, have some source code. You can do all sorts of things like copy and pasting, add specific toggle comments on and off. Again, a lot of this will be demonstrated when we go through actually editing source code. But you should go through this and try to see some of the different options. There's also options for refactoring code, if you change and modify your code, spelling corrections, and so forth. In the View tab, you can see a lot of different windows. You can change the way the windows are organized. There's different perspectives depending on maybe what language you're using in here. We'll be using C. You can usually just keep it as the default perspective. You can rearrange toolbars if you don't like how certain toolbars are there, but I usually just use everything as default. And then there's also certain view windows that are showing up that you can disable if you don't want them to show. But again, manager is usually basic as well as editor and so forth, and the status bar. But if you want to use different windows, go ahead and play around and see what different windows you can open. Search is a basic menu option where you can look for different keywords in your files. It will basically search your project. So you can say find in files. There's also a shortcut for Control F, which is you typically want to use to find searching in files. But you can search all files. You can go to different files. Project will be your project menu option where you can create new files, add new files, remove files. You can see your project tree if you want. You can set arguments to your program. These will be command line arguments. And again, I'll show you how to do this when we go through demonstrations of command line argument programs. There's also the Properties tab, which is really important for setting preferences. Build. Your build is your build option. This is your compiling option, how you compile. So once you created a project, and you have some source code, you can go to build and it will compile that file. It'll also link it. There's also a run option here where you can run. That would be executing the code. Clean is where you recompile and destroy all the object files in the executable. Debug is where I talked about how you find and fix your errors. There's a debug menu option. We're going to go through this in much more detail in another section. But there's all sorts of nice tools associated with debugging. Call stacks, adding breakpoints, stepping through your code to find errors. You don't have to worry about Fortran. Some of these other ones you don't really have to worry about. You can configure different tools. There's different plugins. When we need a plugin, I'll go through the process. Settings, you can set up your environment. You can mess around with this if you want. Where the general settings allow you to show a splash screen on startup. Again, most of this is intuitive and really user preference, what you like and what you don't like. I usually keep these, again, mainly as defaults. The view option, I keep as defaults as well. You want to make sure you have pretty big fonts, so I will change this to usually have bigger fonts. I usually use like a 16 font during demonstrations so that everything's really big. This is for the message logs, but you can also change the editor fonts if you want to see things bigger. There's other options for running static analyzer tools, setting up environment variables. I'm not going to go through all that, but you should see that they are there. CPP checks. Good different project settings or environment settings. Editor settings. These are things directly related to the editor. General settings for font size, tab sizes. You want to have tab sizes and spaces for 4. Again, mainly defaults for this. But if you have certain preferences that you want to change, go ahead and feel free. C editor settings. This will do a lot of the nice things for you by adding preprocessor code, indentation, highlighting things. You can go through this. The syntax highlighting, again. You can set up different indent options, different formatting. Source formatter is usually useful if you have a specific formatting option in mind. There's all sorts of different ones. If you've written code in Java before and you want formatting like that, it will give you examples. So if you want your brackets, excuse me, right after your if blocks, that's one way. I usually, again, just keep it as default. But if you're specific on different coding conventions, coding styles, I just use them. You can use Google. So again, it will do nice different formatting. And you could set that on style, brackets, indentation, formatting. This is pretty useful. Automatic formatting is important. Formatting is important because it makes your code more readable, especially when blocks are, you want to make sure your code is indented for blocks. You want to make sure that all beginning and ending brackets are also line up and so forth. So you want to make sure you format your code. Has options for code completion if you want to disable things. Again, I'm not going to go through everything, but you'll want to check some of this stuff out. Code editor is important. Compiler and debugger. Usually don't have to do much with this. For the compiler settings, you'll want to make sure that it's installed the compiler that came with the IDE. So usually the GNU GCC compiler, the MinGC compiler, or Cygwin compiler. Right? I'm using the GNU GCC compiler, but again, you might see the Min compiler here because that's what came with this IDE, or a Cygwin compiler. But you should have a compiler here. If you don't have a compiler set up here, then that means that you can't run and create any programs. You'll typically see an error when you install this IDE that says no compiler detected. If you install the one that I mentioned with the setup that automatically downloaded MinGW, that will come with that compiler and automatically detect that and install that. But you can play around with different compiler settings if you're more familiar, linker settings, but again, I would just keep this as default. And the debugger we'll talk about in our debugging section. Help for documentation's sake. If you go through some of the different toolbar options, you can do automatic things like saving. Here are some debugging or copying and pasting options. Play has to do with the debugger executing code. This is again related to debugger on that third toolbar by jumping through different statements. Editors, highlighting. Again, as we go through examples, we'll probably use some of these various things. This project management tab is important because this will identify your program and your list of files. So what you're going to see in the project management tab is the interface for the projects. the project view essentially. The editor, well, every time you click on a project or a file inside here, inside the project view, you'll see the editor show up on the right-hand side. And this is where you can edit your source code and then build it and then see the output of the build at the bottom of the window. Typically, there's build log, build messages. Again, if you're using a debugger, you would see that. You may want to resize this to make it bigger. We'll go through all this as well, but you want to be just somewhat familiar with it. These different windows and these different panes, if you will. There are different project templates when you create projects for different types. I didn't want to cover this too much. I just wanted to introduce it to you so that you understood some of the basics. But the best way to learn this is to play around it and also to go to the site and look at the documentation. And you can see all this in here. It's very intuitive. What we'll basically be doing is creating new projects, editing our source files, adding new source code, and then building, compiling, and then also using the debugger. So you're going to find this IDE is very intuitive, very user-friendly, very fast and compact, and has the basic requirements that we need to create and run C programs, and has the basic requirements of most integrated development environments. Thank you.